In this self-portrait from the year 1500, Albrecht Dürer depicted himself as Jesus Christ. Wasn't that a huge blasphemous act of arrogance? In a time when the church was so important, wasn't there any trouble because of it? Why did he portray himself as Jesus in the first place? It sounds to me like a pretty big ego. But what if it wasn't about his ego or provocation at all, but about a plan to elevate his own reputation and that of artists in general? There's a ton of hidden symbolism to discover here. Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait in a fur-trimmed coat is not only his most famous portrait, but also his most unusual. When it was created in the year 1500, Dürer was 28 years old. A new century had begun, and for him it wasn't just a calendar date, but also a personal turning point. Dürer was born in Nuremberg in 1471 and spent his childhood in the house of his father, a goldsmith. There, he first learned the precise craft of goldsmithing, a skill that would later serve him well with his copper engravings. But that's another story. The problem was that he saw his true calling in painting. With his father's blessing, but also his resistance, he began his apprenticeship with the painter Michael Wohlgemuth at the age of 15. After a few years as an employed painter, he made the decision in 1497 to become self-employed and open his own workshop. By around 1500, his workshop was already so successful, especially in the field of printmaking, that his reputation was well established throughout Europe. But this painting is more than just a boast or proof of his entrepreneurial success. Let's take a closer look at the painting. Dürer looks at us frontally, with a rigid and direct gaze that immediately captivates us. This is highly unusual for a self-portrait from this period. Most artists, including Dürer himself, usually painted themselves in a three-quarter view. But for this painting, however, Dürer chose a strictly symmetrical composition. And the colors, these monochromatic earth tones and strong light-dark contrasts, create a dignified and sublime impression. But it makes you wonder, why did he paint himself so idolized, almost like a saintly figure? The answer is a story full of ambition, symbolism, and a profound change in Dürer's self-conception as an artist. The Christ-like portrayal. In the art of that time, nothing was left to chance. Dürer knew this very well. Every element in this painting is carefully selected to send a message that can only be understood if you look closely and know the context from the time the picture was created. The most striking thing about this self-portrait is quite obviously the remarkable resemblance of traditional depictions of Jesus Christ. The strict frontal pose, the symmetrical composition, and the direct gaze are immediately reminiscent of Byzantine icons or the Vera icon, the legendary true image of Christ, as known, for example, from the Shroud of Turin. Even his long brown hair, which falls over his shoulders in a triangular shape, was a deliberate choice. In fact, we know that Dürer's natural hair color was actually reddish blonde. But here he chose a darker, idolized depiction to emphasize the similarity to Jesus. His hand gesture, with the fingers slightly spread, also recalls the traditional blessing gesture found in many Salvator Mundi depictions. That is, depictions of Jesus as the savior of the world. This is not blasphemy or an arrogant presumption, but a conscious act of what is known as imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. Incidentally, I find it interesting that Dürer's self-portrait has a strong similarity in lighting and color to the most expensive painting in the world today, Salvator Mundi. It is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci and is also thought to have been created around 1500. This depiction of Christ contains a hidden reference to the golden ratio, also called the divine proportion. One could argue that a similar hint can be found in the somewhat tense-looking hand position of Dürer in his self-portrait. Note the position of the fingertips. But back to Dürer's supposed blasphemy. There has been much debate among experts as to whether the self-depiction as Jesus Christ was perceived as blasphemous or not. The prevailing opinion, however, is that at Dürer's time, this imitation could be interpreted not as blasphemy, but as an expression of deep piety and humility. In the Renaissance, there was the theological concept that humans were created in the image of God and could approach this ideal again by imitating Christ. By depicting himself in this way, he elevated the human capacity for creation and art itself to a divine gift. Dürer saw himself as a divino artista, a divinely inspired artist, and, in quotes, a second creator after God. This claim to be a second creator was Dürer's clear statement to distance himself from painting as a mere craft and to establish it as an intellectual, indeed divine profession. This concept of the divino artista was new and had been developed in the Italian Renaissance, from where Dürer brought it to Germany, helping it gain importance north of the Alps. He was convinced that his art could reflect God's creation. By adopting the Christ iconography, Dürer legitimatized his art and elevated the creative art to an expression of divine creation. He strategically used this deep religious reverence to raise his profession beyond the realm of craftsmanship and to gain social recognition. The fur-trimmed coat. But the Christ-like resemblance is only one half of the story. In this self-portrait, Dürer wears a so-called Schaube, a kind of long-sleeved coat trimmed with precious marten fur, and he prominently clutches the fur collar with his hand. This garment was a status symbol reserved only for people of high social standing. The marten fur in particular was a sign of the urban elite, of wealthy council members and judges in Nuremberg. But here's the twist. At the time Dürer painted the picture, he was neither rich nor had he achieved this status. He was considered an uneducated craftsman, a status that wasn't even elevated by an official guild of their own. And that's what makes his choice of clothing so bold and interesting. Dürer didn't paint himself as he was, but as he wanted to be. He wasn't yet a council member, but he painted himself as one. It's a powerful assertion of his ambition to be recognized as a council-eligible citizen and an intellectual nobleman, a status he would achieve almost 10 years later, around 1509. By portraying himself with the fur of a counselor and judge, he symbolically unites the artist and the judge. He connected the aesthetic judgment of an artist with legal authority. This goes back to the concept of judizio dell'occhio, the judgment of the eye, or eye for proportion. Dürer believed that it was the artist's task to make the divine order and beauty of the world visible through measure and proportion. He even wrote later that the beauty the artist strives for has a universal, almost legal standard, just as there's a general sense of justice. The marten fur and the Christ-like resemblance thus merge into an image of the artist as a judge of the world. With this term, Dürer wanted to claim the highest moral authority for the artist. The judge of the world at the last judgment, who decides between good and evil, serves as a metaphor for the artist who judges the aesthetic order and beauty of the world. The inscription. To make sure everyone knew who was depicted here, Dürer added a Latin inscription and his monogram. The inscription reads, Albertus Durerus Noricus, ipso me propriis sic effingebam coloribus aetatis anno viginti octo. Translated, it means, thus, I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, painted myself with imperishable colors in the year 28 of my age. The phrase propriis coloribus, however, can also be translated as in true to life, special, or my own colors, which slightly varies the message. However, the most widely accepted translation is with imperishable colors, as it perfectly reflects Dürer's desire to immortal fame and emphasizes the eternity of his art. This inscription was probably added later though. It was painted on a cartouche that has a similar shape to a butterfly. The cartouche is faint and only becomes visible by brightening the background. Next to the inscription on the left side of the picture, Dürer's unmistakable AD monogram can be seen, crowned by the year 1500. This monogram, where the A encloses the D, was his personal brand, his logo. Dürer was one of the first major artists to systematically mark his works with such a signature. This mark quickly became a kind of seal of quality and protection against forgeries. This measure was not without reason, as there is a famous anecdote in art history that a copper engraver in Venice named Marcantonio Raimondi copied Dürer's famous woodcut series Life of the Virgin, and also added Dürer's AD monogram. Dürer was furious when he found out and traveled to Venice to sue Raimondi. The court partially ruled in his favor, forbidding Raimondi from using the monogram, but not from copying the images. This story is considered one of the earliest forms of copyright application in art history. In this way, Dürer protected his intellectual property and ensured that his original works were recognized. However, more recent art historical research shows that this story is likely made up. Raimondi was acting according to the usual practice of art copies at the time, and Dürer probably did not travel to Venice for this reason. The anecdote is likely based on an actual Nuremberg City Council resolution from 1512. This resolution forbade merchants from using Dürer's mark on fraudulently produced prints, and if they did, the prints would be confiscated. This decision, as in the story with Raimondi, protected Dürer's trademark, but not the image idea itself. The message. When all these elements are considered together, the Christ-like depiction, the fur-trimmed coat of the urban elite, and the dated inscription, it becomes clear that Dürer's self-portrait in a fur-trimmed coat is not a simple portrait. It is a strategically thought-out, complex overall statement. But for whom was this message intended? The painting remained in his possession during his lifetime. It is unlikely that he painted it to provoke the masses. Rather, the message in the picture was directed to those who could influence his professional and social recognition. He addressed potential clients, wealthy patrons, and other artist colleagues. The masterful elaboration of details, such as the fine hairs of the fur, showed his artistic skill. At the same time, by depicting himself as an educated, council-eligible citizen with a fur-trimmed coat, he signaled that he was not just a talented craftsman, but a man of ambition and intellect. Through this statement, he wanted to increase the attractiveness for future commissions and raise the standing of his profession. By the way, he did not try to achieve this only with a picture that hung in his house. In addition to his artistic work, he wrote several theoretical writings on geometry and perspective to prove that art is an intellectual activity. This is why in the portrait he does not show himself in his workshop or with a brush or palette, but as an educated Jesus-like nobleman. Such a depiction certainly required a good amount of self-confidence and self-assurance. Dürer had both. He had the artistic skills and success with his workshop. Dürer is today considered a polymath of the Renaissance. He painted the self-portrait on the threshold of a new century to ensure his place as an immortal master, not only for his contemporaries but also for us. He used his own image as a kind of starting point to embody this new, higher status of the artist. In doing so, he changed the perception of the artist profession in Northern Europe and paved the way for future generations who saw themselves as creative minds and respected members of society. Dürer helped ensure that art should no longer be seen as a craft, but as a creative achievement. In doing so, he shaped the identity of the modern artist. And that's why it's art.